Alright, welcome back everyone. So in this video, we're going to learn about CSS syntax. And before we do so, let's quickly recap what we did in the previous video. And what we did was basically learn how to link our CSS file to our HTML document, and we used the link element for that. So over here, we put the style CSS inside of the href attribute, which is basically specifies the location of the resource that you want to link. And let's take a look at our style CSS. And over here, what we have is a basic CSS rule, and we're going to learn about that in a second. And over here, we're basically just changing the background color of the body element to be green. So on the right hand side, we have that page that has a background color of green. Cool. Well, now let's talk about what the CSS rule actually is. So over here, what we have is called the CSS rule, and we're going to be using multiple CSS rules to style different elements on our page. Over here, we're just styling the body, but you can definitely style more. And that's in fact what we're going to be doing today. Well, now let's actually break down the CSS rule piece by piece. And for that, I'm actually going to be using that CSS diagram on the right hand side. Cool. So let's talk about that. And CSS is going to consist of the following. So we're going to have the selector, and selector is pretty much something that you will be using to target specific HTML element, and the declaration block. And within the declaration block, you will have one or more declarations. So over here, we just have one declaration, but you can totally have more. And each declaration is going to be separated from one another using that semicolon. So the declaration itself is going to consist of two things. The property in this case is going to be the background color and its value. And over here we have the green, and you can totally change the green to be red, and then your page is going to turn red. So let's go ahead and come back to our page and continue with exploring our CSS rules. So what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to have a little bit more HTML. So over here, what are we gonna do? Let's create an article, and inside of the article we're gonna have the heading, and we're gonna say CSS is awesome. Cool. And below that we are going to have some paragraph, and we're gonna use some Latin text. Cool. Perfect. So let's just copy that article again below, so we can have two articles. And for the second one, we're gonna change CSS to be HTML is awesome. So let's go ahead and save the page and refresh it. Cool. So now we have our two articles in place. Well, now let's go ahead and just play around with different CSS rules. Let's actually go ahead and move our style CSS on the right hand side, and the way that I do it is I'm basically just dragging style CSS to the right side of my coding editor, which is VS Code in this case. Cool. So let's go ahead and play around with it. What if we want to change the background color of our heading elements, so all our H1s? Well, we can follow the similar format as above. So instead of the body, we will be writing H1 because the H1 is the element that we want to style. Then we're going to be writing our declaration block, and for our declaration, we will be styling the background color. So let's go ahead and change the background color to be red. Let's go ahead and save the file and refresh the page. So now what we see is every H1 is going to have the background color of red. And what you can do is you can definitely go ahead and play around with it. Change the H1 to be P, save the file, refresh the page, and now all our paragraphs are going to be red. That's just because we are targeting all P elements. And this is the most basic selector that you can go with, which is pretty much going to be your element selector. And the way that element selectors work, they basically select the element based on the element's name. So over here, we're specifying the P, thus it will select all P elements on our page. If we change the P to be H1, it will select all H1 elements on the page. Well, how about we play with it a little bit more? Let's go ahead and remove this part. And for our HTML, what I'm gonna do is I'm actually going to do the following. I'm gonna give each heading an ID attribute, and for the ID attribute, for its value, I'm just gonna write, for the CSS, I'm gonna write CSS heading, and I'm gonna do the exact same thing for our HTML article. So I'm gonna write the ID, and I'm gonna write HTML heading. Perfect. So now let's learn about another CSS selector, which is going to be ID selector. Well, right now we have multiple H1s on the page. We have the CSS is awesome and HTML is awesome. So what if I want to style the specific heading? What if I want to style the CSS is awesome and I don't want to touch the HTML is awesome? Well, for that, what we can do is we can use the ID selector. An ID selector is basically using the ID attribute of an HTML element to select a specific element on the page. So over here, if we want to target CSS heading, or we want to target that heading altogether, right, we are going to be using that CSS heading ID attribute. So let's break this syntax down. So to select an element with a specific ID, what you need to do is you need to write a hash symbol followed by the ID of an element that you want to select, which is going to be CSS heading in our case, and followed by the declaration block. And over here, what we're going to do is we're basically going to be styling the background color again. So let's go ahead and choose the white as our color, refresh our page, and boom. Right now, notice what we have is we only have the CSS is awesome that has a background color of white, and HTML is awesome still doesn't have the background color. So once again, the reason for that is because we used the ID selector. We targeted an element with a specific ID called CSS heading over here, this H1, and we changed the background color of it to be white. Thus, on the page, only CSS is awesome is white. So now I want to introduce something new. So previously we've been using IDs to identify a unique element on the page, but we can use classes to identify multiple or a group of elements within the page. So let's go ahead and give the article paragraph a class, and the class is going to be article paragraph. And cool, we're going to give the exact same class to the other paragraph because both of them are article paragraphs, and we'll be using these classes to actually style these paragraphs. So previously what we did something like this, right? We selected the paragraph and changed the background color of that paragraph to be, let's say, red, right? And if we refresh the page, now we have both of these paragraphs red. But what happens if we have more paragraphs? What happens if we just have the random paragraph over here below all the articles? Well, now that paragraph is also going to be red. But what if I just want to style the article paragraphs? Well, for that, you can use a class selector, and the class selector is pretty much going to select all elements within the specific class attribute. So let's go ahead and try this out. I'm going to remove that P with the background color of red, that CSS rule, and we're going to change that up a little bit. So let's go ahead and write the CSS class selector. And for that, to select an elements with a specific class, what you need to do is you need to write a dot and followed by the class name, which is going to be article paragraph. And we need to give a declaration block, and inside of that we need to have the background color of, let's say, blue, right? Let's go ahead and refresh the page, and what we see is that all three paragraphs has turned blue, and the reason for that is because the last paragraph has also the class attribute of article paragraph. So let's go ahead and remove that and save the page and refresh it, and now what we see is only 2 of these 3 paragraphs has turned blue, and the reason for that is only the article paragraphs has the class attribute of article paragraph. So since we're targeting that class article paragraph specifically, only the paragraphs with, or only the elements with that class will have the background color of blue. That's pretty much it what comes to basic CSS selectors. So over here we have the element selector that uses the element's name to target specific elements within the page. We have the ID selector that uses a specific ID to target an element on the page, and notice it's prefixed with a hash symbol. That's really important for ID selectors. And obviously we have the class selectors, and we use the dot in contrast with that hash symbol. So whenever you write the dot, that targets an element with article, in this case, article paragraph class. Well, we have been playing a lot with colors, so let's explore that. And we're going to be using the article paragraph as an example. So over here, we have the background color of blue. Well, you can go ahead and change it to be white or almost any color that you have in mind. In fact, you have 140 different colors that are available, or color names that are available. Well, if you want to use a really specific color, well, you will have to go with something else. You'll have to go with some color model. And let's talk about different color models that are available to you. And the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm actually going to introduce comments in CSS. And the way that you write comments in CSS is basically / and asterisk, and then you write the actual comment. And at the end of the comment, what you need to do is you need to put the asterisk and /. So everything between these special symbols is going to be a comment. So that line is pretty much going to be completely ignored. So let's go ahead and introduce the first color model that's going to be available for us. And I'm just going to make our CSS file. I'm just going to buy some space for our CSS. And let's go ahead and introduce the first one, which is going to be RGB. So the RGB is a color model that uses the different amounts of red, greens, and blue. So pretty much you just specify the number from 0 to 225, and 0 being 0 amount of red, and 255 is going to be the maximum red. And do the exact same thing for green and blue. So let's go ahead and play around with it. I'm going to change the blue to be 0. I'm going to save the file and I'm going to refresh the page. And now what you can see is that your article paragraph has turned completely red. And the reason for that is because we have a maximum amount of red and we have 0 on the green and blue. And you can go ahead and play around with it. You can change that to be 0 for red and 255 for green. And now if we save a file and refresh the page, now everything is going to be completely green. So you can go ahead and play around with it. Also in your coding editor, what you can do is you can actually hover over the RGB and you can basically go ahead and play around with that tool. You can go ahead and select the color and use the color picking and choose the color that you want. And over here, it gives you the RGB value for that color that's currently selected. Well, let's go over another coloring model that we have available. So I'm going to comment out line 11 and I'm going to go over another one, which is going to be the RGBA. So the RGBA is really similar to RGB. It just adds another value, which is going to be called alpha, which stands for alpha transparency. So basically, alpha transparency is going to dictate how transparent your element is. So let's go ahead and just pick 255 for red, 0 for green, and 0 for blue. And we're going to be changing the alpha value. So we're going to start with 1. Alpha value is going to range from 0 to 1. So let's go ahead and refresh the page, and now we see that's completely red. Well, let's change 1 to be 0.5, for example. So over here, we have that color basically transparent. So it is turning a bit brownish, but basically you can do the exact same thing. You can bring up that color picking tool and you can play around with that column. And this is pretty much going to be your alpha value. So 1 is being completely opaque and 0 is being completely transparent. So go ahead and play around with it and you will see different results. So as you can see, 0 is going to be completely transparent, so we see that green in the background. Well, another way that you can choose your color is using something that's called a hexadecimal value. So pretty much what you can do is you can write a hexadecimal value for your color, and over here let's just write the white color. So it's going to be 6 Fs, and I'm going to break it down in a bit. So let's save it and refresh the page. So the hexadecimal value is pretty much going to be really similar to your RGB in a way that your first 2 letters is going to be the amount of red, the second 2 are going to be the amount of green, and then the last 2 are going to be the amount of blue. So it's pretty much hexadecimal value for your RGB color, and it could range anywhere from 3 to 8 characters. And if you know how to read the hexadecimal value, if we convert that to be a decimal, it's pretty much 2 Fs are pretty much going to be 255. So 255, 255, 255 is going to give you the white color. Well, now let's go ahead and talk about another color model that we have. So I'm going to go ahead and comment this line out. By the way, in order to comment it out, the shortcut is going to be command and / or control and / if you're on Windows. So let's go ahead and change the background color and use the new model, which is going to be the HSL, which stands for hue, saturation, and lightness. And the way that the HSL model is going to work is that hue is going to define the color on the color wheel. It's going to range from 0 to 360, 0 and 360 being red, 120 is green, and 240 is blue. So let's go ahead and change it to be 120, for example. Then the saturation. So the saturation is going to define how saturated your color is going to be. The 0% is going to be gray and 100% is going to be full color, so full saturation. Generally, you want to go with with a 100% to represent your true color. And keep in mind that this is going to be the percentages. If you're not going to include the percentages, it's not going to work. And the lightness is going to define how much color your color is going to receive. So 0% is going to be completely black and 100% is going to be completely white. And once again, to truly represent your color, you want to go with the 50%. So generally, your saturation is going to be at 100% and your lightness is going to be at a 50%. So let's go ahead and refresh our page. And now you see that our background color for our paragraphs has turned green. So what you can do is you can go ahead and play around with it. You can change 120 to be 240 and refresh the page, and now it's going to be completely blue. And let's actually play around with it. I'm just gonna make the browser a bit bigger for a second. I'm gonna inspect the page, right click on the page and click inspect, and now you should have that inspector opened on the browser. And go ahead and use that selector tool, select the element that you want to inspect. In this case, it's going to be one of the paragraphs that has color, and over here you have that class article paragraph, and as you can see, you have the background color and the HSL. So go ahead and click on that color little square over here that has a blue inside of it, and over here what you can do is you can actually go ahead and play around with different models. So you have the hex, you have the RGBA, you have the HSLA, and the A is pretty much the same as with RGBA. It's alpha transparency, how transparent your color is. And with HSL, what you can do is you can go ahead and play around. So this color, this wheel, or well, it doesn't look like a wheel, but this is where you're going to be picking your colors. This is your color wheel essentially. Notice it starts with red and it ends with red. This is your color wheel. And notice as I drag my cursor over it, the value for the hue is changing. So it ranges from 0 to 360. So you can go ahead and play with it in your inspector. It's a really useful tool, and you will be definitely digging into it a lot more as we go. So I'm gonna bring everything back to normal and close the inspector tool. Cool. So let's refresh the page to bring the blue color back, and let's actually play around with our fonts. So let's go ahead and play around with fonts. And the first property that we're gonna talk about is going to be the font family. So the font family is pretty much the property that's going to specify the font for your element. And let's go ahead and, as you can see, the VS Code actually gives you a lot of the predefined fonts. This is the website fonts, and you can go ahead and select the Arial, Helvetica, and Sans Serif. So let's talk about that for a second. And the font family property can pretty much hold several font names. So over here we have Arial, Helvetica, and Sans Serif. So if your browser doesn't support Arial, it will choose Helvetica, and if it doesn't support any of those two, it will choose the Sans Serif font that is available. So Arial and Helvetica are going to be the names for specific fonts, and both of those fonts belong to the sans serif generic family. So if your browser doesn't have any of those two fonts, it will pick the font that is the sans serif font. So let's go ahead and just comment out that background color so we can see it better, and save it and refresh the page. And now you see that the font has turned, it is pretty much a bit different. You can see the difference over here, right? This is the font that we had before, and now this is different font for the paragraph, for article paragraphs. Let's go ahead and play around with it a little bit more. What we can do is we can also change the font size for your font. Let's go ahead and change it using the font size property. So the font size property will accept different values. You can go ahead and pick large, for example, save the file and refresh the page, and now you will have a larger font. So these values are going to depend on the font that you choose. So let's go ahead and stick with pixels. You can go ahead and pick pixels. So let's go ahead and choose 16 pixels for that. And the 16 pixels is pretty much going to be the default size for the font. You can go ahead and change it to be 26 to make it look bigger and much bigger. So over here you see the difference. This is the 16 pixels and this is going to be 26 pixels. Perfect. Well, Last but not least, let's talk about the font weight. So the font weight is pretty much going to specify how thick your font is going to be. And what you can do is you can pick the numbers from 100 to 900, or you can pick bold, bolder, lighter, and you basically have multiple different options over here. So the normal is going to be your normal font. Notice nothing is going to be different, but if I choose it to be bold, it's going to be pretty much bold, right? And you can also go with numbers. If you go with 100, notice how your font is going to look different. And notice if you go with 900, which is the maximum boldness, yeah, there you go. It's going to be completely bold. So that's going to be it for this video. And in the next video, what we're going to do is we are going to explore the box model. So stay tuned for that, and I'll catch you later.